He lost his family, his home, and his respect. All he had left was an old trailer and his faithful dog. But it was the dog who showed the veteran a path that changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The trailer was always colder at night, even when the old space heater hummed in the corner with a faint, dying whine. Malcolm Johnson had grown used to the chill seeping through the aluminum walls and the metallic creak of the wind pushing against the frame. Still, sometimes he would lie awake in the darkness, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and feel as though the cold wasn't just in the room, but in his bones, in his very blood. The war had left its souvenirs inside him long before the world stripped him of everything else. He had not always lived like this, with rust spreading across the skin of a trailer and the faint smell of mildew rising from the floorboards. Once, he had worn his uniform with pride, and people had saluted him as a man of honor. He remembered stepping off a plane in his dress blues, medals glinting on his chest, and the applause of strangers in an airport terminal who thanked him for his service. He remembered the faces of young men who had once looked to him for guidance, who had followed his orders in the field with trust that went deeper than words. He had been Captain Johnson, a man who made decisions in seconds that decided whether boys lived or died. The decades of service were not without cost. There had been ambushes in deserts and mountains, nights when tracers tore through the dark like streaks of lightning, and mornings when he counted his men and realized not all of them had returned. A piece of shrapnel had lodged itself near his spine years ago. Surgeons had taken out what they could, but the pain never left, only dulled and flared like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. His left knee, twisted badly in a fall during a rescue mission, never healed right. Every step now reminded him of what he had given, and yet the wounds that broke him most deeply had not come from bullets or blasts. They had come later, in silence, in the conference room of a tribunal, where the faces of men he had once trusted looked away from him. He had always believed that integrity was unshakable, that the truth would eventually clear his name. But when a group of officers needed someone to take the fall for missing funds and forged contracts, it was his name that went on the papers. He had been the one with the reputation for honesty, and so his downfall gave cover to the guilty. In the hearing, his voice trembled with anger as he denied the charges, but his colleagues shifted uncomfortably and said nothing. He walked out of that room stripped not only of his rank, but of the dignity he had carried through decades of service. The scandal spread faster than the truth ever could. His face disappeared from plaques, his name from newsletters, his medals tucked away into a cardboard box rather than displayed with pride. His wife began to meet his eyes less often at the dinner table, as though she were ashamed to share his name. Their children, both grown and with families of their own, stopped bringing their kids to visit. The silence of their absence hurt worse than any words they might have hurled. One by one, the bonds that had defined his life frayed and snapped until he was left with only his dog and the lingering echo of what he had once been. The collapse of his family was slow, stretched across months of financial strain and bitter conversations. His wife told him she could not continue living in a house that felt like a prison of debt. She had endured the deployments, the separations, and the long nights wondering if he would come home alive. But the scandal, the whispers at church, the strained smiles from neighbors that she could not bear. When she left, she did so quietly, taking her clothes and photographs of the children, leaving him with the hollow spaces on the walls where family pictures had once hung. His children did not come to him directly. They sent messages, short and sharp, that said everything without saying much at all. They spoke of embarrassment, of opportunities ruined, of their own children teased because their grandfather had been dishonorably discharged. They told him to sell the house, to disappear, to stop making things worse. The final call he received ended with words that burrowed into him like shrapnel. "We don't want to see you again." The bank had been patient at first, but patience had limits. Late notices piled on the kitchen table until the table itself was hauled away by men who came with papers and cold eyes. The foreclosure was swift. He stood in the driveway watching strangers carry furniture through the front door, each item another piece of his life stripped from him. The old house, filled with echoes of birthdays and Christmas mornings, no longer belonged to him. His medals, the photographs, the folded flag given to him when his closest friend was buried. These were stuffed into a few boxes that fit into the back of his trailer. That was all he carried with him when he drove away from the neighborhood that had once been his sanctuary. Now he lived at the edge of the city where warehouses stood empty, their windows shattered, their walls covered in graffiti. The trailer sat on cracked asphalt, surrounded by weeds that pushed through fissures like stubborn survivors. The air smelled of rust and oil. Nights were long, cold, and quiet, except for the sound of distant trains. He shared it all with Shadow, his black German shepherd, who never left his side. Shadow had been with him since the dog was a pup. Over the years, he had trained him, walked with him through forests and neighborhoods, and spoken to him in the long silences when human voices had abandoned him. The dog was no longer young, his muzzle streaked with gray, but his body remained strong, his eyes bright and watchful. Shadow was his guard, his companion, and the last living soul who had not turned away. When the world grew darkest, it was Shadow's head pressed against his leg that kept him steady. Life in exile was a repetition of small struggles. Malcolm stretched a veteran's pension that barely covered food. He bought bags of rice, cans of beans, and dog food that Shadow devoured gratefully. His body ached from the cold, from the damp mattress, from the constant reminder of injuries. Some nights he would wake in sweat, hearing again the voices of men lost overseas, seeing the tribunal where they erased his honor. He would rise and sit by the window, staring at the city's glow in the distance, while Shadow pressed against him, warm and silent. Yet Malcolm was not entirely alone in his exile. He had found a rough kind of fellowship among the other discarded men who haunted the streets. There were veterans sleeping beneath bridges, men who had once carried rifles and now carried cardboard signs. He shared cigarettes and cans of soup with them, listening to their stories and recognizing his own pain reflected back. The city had no use for them, just as it had no use for him. But in the quiet exchanges of those broken lives, there was at least the honesty of survival. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rhythm of hunger and cold. He would rise with the dawn, stretch his stiff limbs, and walk with Shadow to the convenience store that sold cheap coffee. Sometimes he caught glimpses of himself in the glass door, a man with a lined face, stooped shoulders, eyes that looked older than his years. People passed by without recognition. No one saw the officer he had once been. No one remembered his name. It was during these long days of exile that he began to sense that something was shifting. At first, it was just the silence. Friends he had met under the bridge or by the soup kitchen did not appear at their usual spots. Then there were rumors, scraps of words about men vanishing, about strange trucks in the night. He did not yet know what to make of it. He only knew that the loneliness of his trailer was deepening, that even the small fellowship of forgotten men was thinning out. On those nights, when the wind rattled the thin walls and the memories pressed hardest against him, Malcolm would place his hand on Shadow's back and whisper to himself that at least the dog had not abandoned him. Shadow would lift his head, ears alert, and watch the darkness as though guarding them both from ghosts. The dog was the only proof left that loyalty still existed in the world. And so Malcolm Johnson, once Captain Johnson, once a man saluted and celebrated, now lived as a shadow himself. Betrayed by colleagues, abandoned by his wife, disowned by his children, stripped of his house and his honor, he clung to the single companion who had never faltered. The exile was complete, but in the deep silence of those nights, with shadow pressed against him, he felt the faint stirrings of something he could not yet name. It was not hope, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a purpose that would draw him back into a fight he had never expected to face again. The winter nights stretched longer in the part of the city where Malcolm lived, the kind of darkness that seemed to carry weight and settle against the skin. The days came and went in a routine so familiar it dulled the senses. Waking to the damp chill of the trailer, sharing a meager breakfast with Shadow, walking the cracked sidewalks past shuttered warehouses and rusted fences. Yet something in that routine began to shift, so quietly at first that he almost dismissed it. The faces he had grown accustomed to seeing among the forgotten veterans of the streets began to vanish. Men who had shared smokes and traded war stories beneath the viaduct no longer showed up at their corners. The familiar shuffling gait of Tom, who once carried a duffel bag patched with old campaign ribbons, disappeared from the block. Earl, who muttered in his sleep about firefights and jungles decades old, stopped turning up at the soup kitchen line. At first, Malcolm thought the inevitable had come for them. They were old, their bodies broken by war and worsened by years on the street. But then, another disappeared, and another, until the silence grew too thick to ignore. Shadow seemed to notice it before Malcolm did. The dog's ears pricked on nights when Malcolm heard nothing. His low growls rolled through the darkness at the sound of distant engines idling too long in alleys. Once, near the edge of the abandoned rail yard, Shadow dragged him toward a patch of ground where cigarette butts and boot prints pressed into the dirt looked fresh. Malcolm bent down, pressing his stiff knee into the gravel, and found a set of dog tags half buried in mud. They belonged to one of the missing men, and the cold metal in his hand struck him like a memory. It was not chance, not some natural scattering of old soldiers succumbing to the years. Someone was taking them. The city, indifferent as ever, pretended not to see. Malcolm went to the precinct once, standing in the fluorescent-lit lobby with Shadow waiting at his side. He told the desk sergeant about the disappearances, about the dog tags, about the trucks without plates that prowled the streets at night. The sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork. Men like that, he said, drifted. They moved on. They drank themselves to death, or froze in alleys. It wasn't a police matter. Malcolm could read the unspoken words in the man's eyes. These were lives already written off, and so were the complaints of a disgraced veteran. When Malcolm left, the weight of futility pressed on him, but he also knew the truth. No one else would care, so he would have to. He began to walk longer circuits with Shadow, retracing the paths where the men had last been seen. He kept to the shadows, his limp slowing him, but not stopping him. At night, he would sit in the trailer with a notebook salvaged from a donation bin, writing down names, dates, and places, the way he once drew up patrol routes and mission details. The soldier in him had never died. It had only been buried beneath disgrace. Now it stirred again, sharpened by suspicion. He sketched crude maps of alleys, marked places where unmarked trucks idled too often, circled the shelters where men had vanished. Piece by piece, the outline of something larger began to emerge. It was Shadow who gave him the first real lead. One night, the dog stiffened beside him, nose high, tail low, muscles tense. Then he pulled forward, leading Malcolm down an alley where the stink of oil and trash clung heavy. At the far end, stood a warehouse whose windows had been boarded up. But the boards were too new. The padlock on the gate too polished compared to the rusted chain link around it. Malcolm crouched in the darkness, pain stabbing through his knee, and watched as a van without plates rolled slowly to the door. 2 men emerged, their voices low, their movements quick. They unlocked the gate, opened the warehouse, and disappeared inside. When they came out, they weren't alone. A third figure stumbled between them, head bowed, hands bound behind his back. Malcolm's breath caught. The man being led was another veteran he knew, one who used to sit near the soup line with a battered guitar across his knees. He wanted to shout, to rush forward, but instinct rooted him in silence. He pressed a hand to Shadow's collar. Feeling the tension coiled in the dog's body. When the van doors slammed and the engine roared to life, Malcolm forced himself to remain still until the sound faded. Only then did he exhale, his heart pounding with the knowledge that the disappearances were no longer a question of chance. They were abductions, deliberate and organized. For days he trailed the movements of those vans, Shadow at his side. He slept little, eating only enough to keep himself on his feet. He watched men dragged into vehicles, saw how they were always chosen from the ranks of the discarded, the ones no one would miss. They were taken swiftly, efficiently, like shipments in a system too practiced to be new. What gnawed at him was the silence afterward. No bodies, no arrests, no news. It was as if the men had been erased. The discovery filled him with a simmering rage. He had fought enemies in foreign lands, men who wore uniforms and carried weapons openly. But this enemy hid in plain sight, preying on those already broken by the country they had served. The betrayal echoed his own. Deeper now because it was not only his honor at stake, but the lives of men like him. The government had forgotten them, the city despised them, and now someone had decided they were useful only as tools to be exploited and discarded. He pressed deeper into the investigation, following tracks through vacant lots, finding cigarette packs and scraps of duct tape left behind in haste. He noticed how certain alleyways reeked faintly of disinfectant, how doors of some warehouses were scarred from being forced open and shut too many times. He pieced together the picture of a network, one that snatched the vulnerable and used them like fuel. Whispers reached him that some of the missing had been seen laboring at construction sites under guard, their faces hollow, their movements sluggish, before vanishing again. One evening he returned to the warehouse he had marked on his map. The gate was ajar this time, the lock gone. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with sweat and the metallic tang of blood. He found rows of old mattresses on the floor, stained and sunken. Rusted cans and plastic bottles littered the corners. There were ropes frayed from use, chains bolted into the walls. He crouched by a mattress and saw initials carved faintly into the concrete letters of a name he recognized. One of the missing had been here, scratching proof of his existence into stone. Malcolm rose slowly, his fists trembling. Whoever had done this was not just exploiting men. They were erasing them, grinding them down until only marks in the concrete remained. Shadow paced the floor restlessly, nose brushing the ground, whining softly at the places where the scent of human suffering lingered. Malcolm placed a hand on the dog's back, steadying himself as the fury in his chest threatened to consume him. He had been betrayed before, by officers who sold his name to protect themselves, by a family that turned their backs on him. But this betrayal, this theft of lives was larger, crueler, and it clawed at the last part of him that still believed in duty. As he stood in the empty warehouse, the decision crystallized in him. He could not walk away. He could not tell himself it wasn't his fight. The men who had been taken were his brothers, not by blood, but by bond, bound to him by the shared burden of war. If no one else would fight for them, then he would. The disgrace that had driven him into exile no longer mattered. The soldier inside him was awake again, and the mission was clear. He left the warehouse with Shadow at his side, the dog's black form blending into the night. The notebook in his pocket was filled with names, maps, times, details. It was more than scraps now. It was intelligence, the beginning of a plan. He limped back toward the trailer, knowing there would be no turning away. Whatever strength remained in his battered body would be given to this fight. Even if it killed him, he would drag the truth into the light. And as the night deepened, Malcolm felt something he had not felt in years. It was not peace, nor was it comfort, but a kind of clarity, a sharpness of purpose that cut through despair. He had been exiled, stripped of honor, left to rot among the forgotten. But now he had found something worth standing for again. The disappearances were no longer just rumors. They were his war. Shadow pressed close to him, silent, loyal, as if sensing that together they were stepping into a battle neither of them could refuse. The days that followed the night in the warehouse were unlike any Malcolm had lived in years. He had returned to the trailer with the notebook clutched tightly in his hand, his jaw set, his mind sharper than it had been in a long time. The fatigue and resignation that once weighed on him were gone, replaced by the steady fire of purpose. He had spent nights staring at the ceiling, drowning in memories of betrayal and loss. But now he stayed awake for another reason. He planned. He spread the notebook on the chipped counter in the trailer, marked pages with crude maps and rough sketches of buildings, calculated the time of truck arrivals, and studied the movements of men who guarded the warehouse and its surrounding alleys. Shadow lay close by, ears twitching, eyes half closed, yet always alert, as if sensing that his master was preparing for war. The soldier within Malcolm had never truly died. It had only been buried under shame, exile, and loneliness. Now it stirred as if awakened from a long sleep. He cleaned his old gear, hands working with the practiced precision of habit. The knife he had carried through deployments, dulled by years of neglect, was sharpened on a stone until its edge gleamed. A battered rucksack, once used in deserts across the ocean, was packed with rope, makeshift bandages, and the remnants of ammunition he still owned. He even unearthed the sidearm he had managed to keep hidden from creditors and banks, its weight familiar in his hand, a reminder that though stripped of titles, he was still capable of fighting. He walked with Shadow across the streets that had become part of his investigation. Together, they observed, waiting for patterns to repeat. He marked the time the trucks left, the routes they seemed to favor, and the way the guards exchanged shifts under the cover of night. He noticed the subtle signals between men, the way one tapped a railing or whistled softly before another opened a gate. All of it reminded him of enemy encampments he had once dismantled in far-off countries. The difference now was that the war was here, on the cracked asphalt of the city that had cast him out. The decision to strike came when he saw a group of men being dragged into one of the warehouses. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes torn, their steps unsteady. One stumbled, and the guards shoved him forward with the butt of a rifle. Malcolm's blood ran hot, his hands trembling with the urge to move. He followed at a distance, watched them disappear behind the heavy doors, and knew he could not delay any longer. Every night he waited meant another man would vanish into silence, another life extinguished by cruelty. The plan was dangerous, perhaps impossible, but the choice had already been made. The night of the assault was cold, the kind of chill that made the lungs burn with every breath. Malcolm dressed in layers of old fatigues, his body protesting each movement, but his will stronger than the pain. Shadow moved silently at his side, dark coat blending into the shadows, the perfect partner for a man who no longer had comrades. They approached the warehouse from the rail yard, where broken fences and piles of rusted scrap offered cover. Malcolm's heart thudded steadily, not with fear, but with the clarity of a soldier who knew exactly what had to be done. He placed a hand on Shadow's back, signaling him to stay low, then crept toward the outer wall. The guard near the gate smoked a cigarette. Distracted, his posture lazy. Malcolm remembered dozens of similar moments in distant lands, when inattentive guards paid the price for underestimating the dark. He moved quietly, years of training guiding his steps, the knife steady in his hand. In seconds, the man crumpled to the ground, the cigarette rolling into the dirt. Shadow padded forward, sniffed the air, then sat silently, as if understanding that noise could cost them everything. Inside the warehouse, the stench was worse than before. The air was thick with sweat, blood, and rot. Dim lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Malcolm's eyes adjusted quickly, and what he saw clenched his stomach with both rage and sorrow. Dozens of men lay on filthy mattresses, some bound, some too weak to move. Their eyes flickered with fear when the door creaked open, expecting another beating or another order. But when they saw Malcolm's face, gaunt but resolute, and the great black dog at his side, confusion spread through them. Malcolm motioned for silence and moved among them quickly, cutting bindings, whispering instructions though his voice was little more than breath. He urged them to rise, to gather strength, to prepare for escape. Some struggled to stand, their bodies too frail, but Shadow nosed at them gently, encouraging them until they leaned on one another. Malcolm's soldier's mind calculated every second, knowing the guards would return. That time was their most dangerous enemy. The sound of boots on metal stairs shattered the silence. Guards rushed in, weapons raised, voices shouting. Chaos erupted. Malcolm moved with the precision of experience, taking cover behind steel beams, firing short, controlled bursts from the pistol, each shot placed with purpose. Shadow lunged forward, his body a blur of muscle and teeth, pulling one guard to the ground with a snarl that echoed through the warehouse. The men who had been prisoners staggered back, some crawling, some clutching each other, their fear palpable. Yet in Malcolm's presence, they found a flicker of courage, enough to keep moving toward the exit he had marked. The battle was brutal and close. Malcolm's knee threatened to buckle. His back burned with pain, but adrenaline carried him. He fought not as a man seeking survival, but as a soldier with nothing left to lose. Each strike, each shot, was a piece of his rage made tangible, aimed at the men who had turned his brothers into slaves. Shadow never faltered, his growls deep and relentless, his body throwing itself into danger as if he, too, understood that this was their war. By the time silence returned, the floor was littered with fallen guards, and the air reeked of gunpowder and sweat. The survivors huddled near the exit, their faces pale, their breaths ragged. Malcolm urged them forward, guiding them through the darkness into the open air. The cold night hit them like a wave, but it was freedom, and some wept openly as they stumbled across the rail yard. Shadow trotted at their side, blood matting his fur, but his eyes still burning bright. They found refuge in an abandoned factory on the edge of the city, a place Malcolm had scouted weeks earlier. The walls were broken, the roof sagging, but it offered shelter, and more importantly, it was theirs. The men collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to speak, but in their silence, Malcolm saw the spark of life returning. He walked among them, checking wounds, offering words of encouragement, though his own body screamed for rest. Shadow curled beside him when he finally sat, his warm weight a reminder that loyalty still lived in the world. News of the raid spread quickly, whispered among the forgotten and ignored by officials who wished to keep their hands clean. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Stories surfaced, photographs leaked, and soon the network that had profited from stolen men began to unravel. Some of the guilty were caught, others fled into the shadows, but none would ever escape the mark of exposure. Malcolm did not celebrate. For him, the battle was never about vengeance alone. It was about restoring something that had been taken from them all. The abandoned factory became more than a refuge. It grew into a place of gathering, a fragile community built by men who had been broken but not destroyed. Together, they repaired walls, cleared debris, and fashioned beds from scrap. One man knew carpentry, another remembered farming, another could cook meals from almost nothing. Slowly, life began to hum within those walls. Malcolm, though weary and scarred, found himself at the center of it, not as an officer commanding men, but as a leader rebuilding lives. Shadow became the emblem of their new beginning. His black form patrolled the grounds at night, his presence a silent reassurance that danger would not catch them unaware. The men began to carve his likeness onto the doors, painting crude images of the dog who had fought beside them, who symbolized the loyalty that the world had denied them, but that still lived between a man and his companion. For Malcolm, the transformation was quiet, but profound. He had lost his family, his home, his honor in the eyes of the world. Yet here, among the discarded and the wounded, he found a different kind of family. They did not ask him to explain his past or to justify his failures. They saw him as he was and followed him, not because of medals or rank, but because he had given them hope when they had none. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Malcolm stood outside the factory and watched the men working together. Some repaired windows with scavenged glass, others stacked wood for fires. Their laughter, ragged but real, drifted through the air. Shadow sat at his side, ears perked, tail sweeping the ground slowly. Malcolm reached down, his hand resting on the dog's head, and felt a rare calm settle over him. For the first time in years, he was not haunted only by ghosts. He was surrounded by the living, by proof that even in ruin, something new could be built. He thought of his children then, of the home he had lost, of the tribunal that had broken him. The wounds of betrayal would never vanish. But as he stood in the fading light, the knowledge took root in him that life wasn't over. He had been exiled, stripped of everything, yet from that hollow place had come something unexpected. A brotherhood reborn, a shelter for the forgotten, a second chance to stand for those who could not stand for themselves. Shadow leaned into him, pressing warmth into his leg, and Malcolm allowed himself a rare smile. The world outside might never forgive him, might never restore his name, but here, within these broken walls made whole again, he had found something greater than honor restored. He had found purpose. And so the man who had been betrayed and discarded, who had wandered in exile with only his dog for company, stood once more as a soldier, not in the uniform of the past, but in the quiet strength of one who had chosen to fight for the lost. The battle was not over, but neither was his life. With Shadow at his side and a new family gathered around him, Malcolm Johnson had begun again. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering, and don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too powerful to keep to yourself.